As an archaeologist and paleoethnobotanist, I study the way people living in the past used plants. Most of my research involves plant use by prehistoric groups living in the Midwest. In this presentation, I'll look at use during the late woodland period between 350 and 900. But first, a little background. Unlike modern ethnobotanists who have informants and can make real-life observations, I have to rely on the garbage people left behind to provide clues about what, where, when, and hows of prehistoric plant use. These remains are mostly burned plant parts recovered from houses and pits and are surprisingly informative, providing information about prehistoric environment, technologies, and even ceremony. For example, tobacco seeds are pretty common and tell us that smoking was an important prehistoric ritual. But probably the biggest area of study is subsistence. Identifying the types and patterns of edible archaeological plant remains tells us a lot about what people were eating, and some of the information is surprisingly not what you might expect. When most people think about prehistoric subsistence in eastern North America, they picture the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, members of which may have figured prominently in your Thanksgiving dinner last week. And you would be correct, but only if you're talking about the last couple of hundred years. In fact, corn, beans, and squash all have unique histories of use in the Midwest, beginning with the cultivation of native wild gourds over 4,000 years ago. Mexican pumpkins and beans did not arrive till much later. In contrast, corn was being cultivated widely across the Midwestern United States by AD 1000, or several hundred years earlier than corn, or than beans. Also, corn kernels and cupules are almost invariably the most common subsistence plants that we find at archaeological sites from Illinois, post-dating AD 900 or so. But we know corn was present much earlier. As shown here, a few scattered remains from 3 widely spaced sites have been directly dated using accelerated mass spectrometry to the centuries around 0 AD. One of the questions I've been looking at then is what happened in the interim period. Corn was present very early and cultivated extensively 1,000 years later. Well, what does the archaeological record tell us about the time in between? One idea is that there was a gradual increase in corn use through time. If so, we would expect to see an archaeological recovery pattern like this, with quantities increasing gradually. Until recently, we thought we had this kind of pattern in western Illinois, where over the past 40 years or so, corn has been reported from 25 sites dating to the critical time period. However, when we looked at those records, we noticed an unusual pattern. Almost all these sites also have components dating to the AD 900 or later time period, what we call multi-component sites. So, were we looking at contamination from later occupations or true early corn? The only way to answer this question for sure is to date the corn itself. We can do this using accelerated mass spectrometry, which provides absolute dates on very small items. We selected 14 corn samples from what looked like very good contexts for dating and submitted them to the Illinois State Geological Survey. The results were surprising. In only 2 cases did corn actually date to the late woodland. In all other cases, maize was contamination from either earlier prehistoric or even historic contexts. Based on these dates and the fact that we have virtually no single component late woodland sites with corn, the recovery pattern does not support the gradual increase theory. Rather, corn spikes abruptly at about AD 900. Still, it was present earlier, so why wasn't it being cultivated? For one thing, we think that when it was first introduced, corn was probably seen as a specialty or novelty crop, not as a subsistence godsend. Secondly, we need to consider population biology. Corn is a Mesoamerican domesticate that can't live long in the Midwest without human help. Early introductions were no doubt few and scattered. Consequently, in the absence of fresh germplasm early on, inbreeding depression may have made it impossible to successfully grow corn crops for more than a few generations. They simply died out. While this may be a factor, I think culture is even more important. Late woodland people were seasonally mobile, probably living in relatively small extended family groups and relying on both wild plant resources and a suite of native cultivated plants for subsistence. The native cultivated plants were weedy annuals with wild conspecifics. We think that growing them involved a rather laissez-faire technology compared with the work needed to successfully grow a non-native plant. Corn simply didn't fit in the lifeway, and people didn't need to invest the time and energy into its cultivation. All this changed about AD 900 when we see a shift in socioeconomic system toward full sedentism and population aggregation. By AD 1000, people were living in permanent villages and even towns as exemplified at the site of Cahokia. This new Mississippian lifestyle